Hello, everybody. My name is Benny Safdie. I played Edward Teller, and I'm not going to hold it any longer. I'm going to not wait any longer and introduce the unbelievable, incredible, and the fact that I can even do this is amazing. Christopher Nolan, please.
Amazing. Of course. Sit here.
I'm going to apologize ahead of time because literally when I was approached to do this, all I could think of was the Chris Farley interview with Paul McCartney, where I'm like, yeah, you remember that when you shot with IMAX and made that movie Oppenheimer? It's pretty cool. Like that's kind of how I feel right now. But yeah, so it really was. I'm going to take this as an opportunity just to say off the bat, because this is a WGA. The script itself was so incredible, lifelike, precise, emotional, and just enormous in its scope. And yet, while we were filming, it was one of the most warm, emotional places for me to be as an actor. And then what I learned just seeing you work was really just unreal to experience. And I don't know how those two things go together, so maybe that's the first question, which is how do you take something that's so precise and almost airtight and then transfer that to the screen with all of that other stuff in there? I don't know.
I mean, one of the nicest compliments I've had on the film was actually from Hoyte van Hoytema, director of photography, who I think the second time I showed him the film, I think the first time he was just sort of a bit shell-shocked. But the second time, he very sweetly, he sort of said, well, it's this wonderful thing of you allow us all to be there feeling like we're doing all this stuff and coming up with all that ideas, and I look at it, and it's exactly what you said it was going to be.
Yes.
And I thought it was very sweet of him, but him of all people, or cast members or whatever, of course, could not be further from the truth. But it's the feeling he had watching it, and it's because I mean, I love writing scripts. I could never write a novel. I could never find an authorial voice that I was comfortable with. It's not my thing. But I can write a screenplay because I like the stripped-down form. I like the sort of anonymity of it because it's a skeleton. It's a framework. However detailed it is and however precise it feels, it's a sort of framework you build that you then kind of dip into the world of the film and let things set around it.
And to that, do you think about production ever when you're writing?
I try not to.
Okay.
I mean, you have these different hats you wear, and for me, if I'm thinking as a director, I would never write fade in, nighttime, it's snowing.
Yeah.
You know, you'd be like, I'm not doing that. I'm not doing nights. I don't want to be, how can it snow? How can all of that? And the more films you make, the worse that gets because you know all the pitfalls. You know all the, well, how is that ever going to work? True. So you try and have that firmly to one side and really just be a writer. Just try and visualize in this sort of, I suppose you call it the Euclidean space of kind of perfect production that doesn't exist. You know, you write to that. And that sets the challenge to me as a director, to Emma, who's here somewhere, Emma Thomas, producer.
Yes, please.
That sets the challenge for her. Yeah. And for all the actors, everybody who comes on board, you know, we're aiming for that. We're aiming to represent what's there on the page.
Because, yeah, that's the thing is it's like, and then also the other thing similar to that is adaptation, you know, and taking it from something that exists. And I just did that recently, and it's an interesting thing because it kind of gives you an entryway, but then it becomes something completely different. And once you kind of open it up and make it alive, then it has a mind of its own. I don't know if something similar happened because you really do get to a different place. I don't know.
I mean, I think it's a different discipline, obviously, but there's a point at which it has to become the same. And I think now that I look back on it, I look back at purely fictional scripts I've written that have no basis, you know, originals. You know, I've done all sorts. I've done remakes, I've done adaptations, I've done sequels. I've collaborated with other writers a lot. I've written on my own. But ultimately, for me, every writing process there has to be a draft, whether it's the final draft, whether it's a couple drafts from the end, where it's the same no matter what you're going from, where you own the story, it becomes your own, and it goes through your fingers, you know, into the keys of the word processor and becomes just purely yours. Yeah. And for me, it wasn't so different adapting. I mean, the book Kai Bird and Martin Sherwin spent 25 years writing American Prometheus that this is based on. Martin Sherman in particular, he spent 20 years on his own researching it before Kai came on. And so you have that incredible advantage of that whole world of information and knowing where everything's going, knowing the events, knowing the characters and so forth. But when I look back at the fictional process, the process of writing fiction, it's not so different in that you sort of have to have that sense of a world, of some reality that you haven't written yet, that you're discovering as you write. At least that, for me, that's the process.
Well, and it's, I guess, then so you're not thinking about production, but are you thinking about the person who's reading it when you're writing it? Because this one, as I read it, it felt like you were aware that I was reading it in a way.
Yeah, no, I think I do write for a reader, and the reader is the audience proxy, but you're also writing. There are different drafts for different purposes, but that first draft that goes out into the world, that you set up at a studio, that you show to actors, that's there to sell what the film is on the page, show you what it can be, but also you're trying to draw the reader in and trying to give them a sense of what that world's going to be, how it's going to feel to be in a movie theater watching that.
Yeah.
And different writers do it differently. I try not to sort of break the fourth wall with it. I try not to, you read scripts on us where it says, and then an almighty car chase, the likes of which you've never seen, takes place, or whatever. I try not to do things like that. Yeah. But in the case of this script, one of the things I did, as you'll remember, is all the Oppenheimer material, I told it from the first person. Yeah. So I wrote the stage directions in the first person. I come in, I sit down at the desk, I do this. That immediately helped me feel that I had the right perspective on the material.
Well, it didn't feel like I was reading a movie. It was weird. It was like, because I just started reading. I'd never read it before, but the Beauty and the Damned, I'm just starting it. And there's a section in that where I'm like, wait a second, this is a movie script that he's like writing in there. But again, it kind of had I'm not saying they're the same, but there is a similar vibe that when I sat down and I read multiple versions of the script, and it never felt like a tool for production, if that makes sense. Like it kind of, the story was there, the characters are so, you're understanding who they are. I don't know, I don't, that's kind of me, that's like one of the magic tricks of it, is that I could read it, and it was, and I've had points where I've read scripts before, I'm like, okay, I know what that means, and I'm gonna move on because I've already read that, I know what's gonna happen. But this time I always wanted to kind of go back.
Well, my brother have written with a lot. I showed him the first act as I started to do this, and he reassured me, said, I didn't tell him why I was showing it to him, but he got it immediately, of course. He's like, yeah, it works. And he said, you finally found a way to make the reader read the stage directions. Yes. And I was, and I realized that, for 25 years, I've been trying to get people to read the stage directions because when you read a lot of scripts, you tend to just read the dialogue. And in my films, if you only read the dialogue, you get nowhere. Yeah. You have no idea where you are. You have no idea where you are in chronological terms and everything. Everything is about the stage directions. Yeah. And this script, people did read the stage directions.
It is. That's exactly right. And that is something that I've come across every time because it's so important what's there, especially when you're dealing with looks and like undertones and and I don't know. The other thing is just the sheer number of people in the movie. And the sheer number of people that each have individual brains, if that makes sense. Yeah. And this is where the Chris Farley comes in. It's like, well, how'd you do
that? The way I did it, I took a calculated risk. When I was figuring out how to write the script, I decided that I didn't want to write any composite characters. I said, okay, well, what happens? I mean, given that we're doing something that touched so many lives, the Manhattan Project, I read a statistic, it touched the lives of about 600,000 Americans, the manufacture of the bomb. Yes, 99.9% of them did not know what they were involved in, but that was the scale of industrial effort from the DuPont Corporation, all these other corporations that was required to make this thing work. And so my feeling was, why not trust that with great casting, with great faces, with different energies popping in, that you didn't have to pretend that there's one guy who did these three different things. Yeah. You could have three different people doing the three different things. Yeah. Do you need to remember the names? No, not necessarily. The ones where you do, we try and highlight that in some way. But beyond that, it's just, can Alex Wolff come along and have a unique energy as Louis Alvarez, and so forth. And that way, you build up, I think, a sense of scale, the scale of the project. There were just so many people involved. And you also try to get across this crazy thing that when you start researching it and talking to scientists and talking, the brethren of scientists is so vast and so international, and they all know each other. And you go through Oppenheimer's story, he had 20 best friends. You know, it's a weirdly very, very social occupation, even though it's based on, you know, people sitting around and literally banging their head against the wall and trying to figure something out in the most abstract way possible. But there is this incredible brotherhood, which ultimately, I think, saved him and saved his reputation. And the way, I mean, Rami Malek's character, you know, playing David Hill, you know, that's where you see that scientists, whether they agreed with Oppenheimer or not, when they saw the injustice done to him by the government, they rallied around.
And then it's like, the other thing is every once in a while, you'll be watching a movie and you just feel like it existed. You know, I don't know if does that make sense, where you're just like, oh, that just had, you kind of have this feeling that everything fell into place and that's just how it was. And I kind of feel like that's what's with this movie, because when I watched it, I kind of didn't even remember being there and doing it, because everything just felt like it clicked in a way that it just kind of, I don't know how to explain it other than that, but...
You didn't seem that drunk during shooting.
You know what? It was the cheese you told me to eat to make my voice older. But yes, it was definitely an extreme experience to watch it and just realize all of this stuff. But again, specifically to just talk about the writing of it, just because what's hard to believe, and this part of it is, every single time you jump to the past or to the future, the nonlinear nature, it's exactly as it was in the script, you know? And that to me is, that kind of precision is really difficult. And that's why I was saying, were you aware of production? Because every once in a while you'll cut in for like one line that in a period piece requires an enormous amount of work, but maybe you didn't.
I didn't. I mean, the infamous scene 16, you may remember from the screenplay, which is the moment where Niels Bohr says, you know, can you hear the music? He says, yes, I can. Cut to scene 16, which is just a ton of shit and a lot of very abstract. My closest effort at writing a T.S. Eliot poem or something, you know, just like a bunch of stuff thrown in. And then, you know, Neil Otero, the first AD, you know, dutifully every week would be like, can we talk about scene 16? I'd be like, no, I'm not ready to discuss that just yet. And in the end, we started to knock off bits and pieces. And this is the great thing about working with people you work with for many years, like Nilo, like Hoyte van Hoytema, where they sort of trust you that, we're all going to put ideas into that. We're going to talk to Killian. So you're in your room, you're having your apocalypse now moment. It's like, what's going on in that room? How are you visualizing these things? And we try and create a set of images and a set of sort of playground with, you know, Andrew Jackson, the visual effects supervisor, who'd been working for months and months on how to get these thoughts across. And then we'd start to build it out for production from that. And ultimately, the people in production were very, very efficient. And so they were able to finally let me go to Zurich for a day and shoot the spires there and the university, and we were able to get above the clouds and shoot, you know, all those great, you know, cloud trails and shots and things. But we didn't know the whole way through whether we'd be able to do that, whether we'd run out of money or whatever. And so that sequence was always sort of protected in that way of like, we'll do what we can, if you like. You know, we had him watching an orchestra playing Rite of Spring, and finally Nilo's like, well, how about a record? I'm like, okay, we'll do a record. That works, that's great, you know. So it's that sort of thing, but the precision, for me, the precision, you know, I'm writing not for production, I'm writing for the screen. I'm writing for how the audience is going to see it, what image follows what image, and getting as close to what I think it needs to be as possible. You then have to give it to the whole team to interpret. Say, okay, how do we make that actually work?
So, you know, in a way, it's almost like the ultimate hype document. You know, like this is the ultimate thing, and we're going to get as close to that as we physically can.
Yeah. And then you're also, in the case of this material, and I think it's one of the huge advantages for me as a director, having written the script, is they're real people with real histories. And so whereas when I write fiction, an actor comes to me and says, okay, what did I have for breakfast? Why am I, you know, why am I in this state? What's going on? And my one brain has to make all this stuff up. Every day, the GAC meeting with, you know, all those different characters coming in with Downey and Killian and everybody there, everyone at that table knew more about their character than I did. And so they could go, I could say, okay, have the argument for real. Say to Dane DeHaan, just like start screaming at these guys, throwing stuff at them. You know what I mean? Just let's get the whole argument going. And then ultimately, yes, I'm using the pieces more or less that were there in the script, but they're getting the energy all around it so that on the cutting room floor are all the lead-ins and lead-outs. So even when I'm just doing the one line, as you'll remember, we're shooting the whole the whole thing.
So then that's probably why I felt the way that I did. It's because in the process I had so much more memory of things that were happening. Yeah. And then again, I guess it's also just, but you're also, to know that you're finding these things in that moment, responding to how we're saying things or doing things is also really, I don't know if anybody else knew that. To me, when I saw that happening on set, it was like a dream to think that that was even, I didn't think that that's what this was going to feel like when I read the script, you know? But, yeah, so I guess I wrote a bunch of stuff down.
I was going to try and make a question from that, because
I couldn't. Here we go. Let's see. Oppenheimer, he really didn't discover the atomic bomb, but he facilitated the process that made it possible. Do you see a connection between that idea and this movie at all?
Gosh, that's a deep, all right.
I knew I had a good one that I was afraid to ask, and I wrote it down.
Okay. Well, I mean, for me, the paradox of Oppenheimer's involvement with the bomb was, can you pin this massive movement in history to any one individual? This guy did not split the atom. You know, he wasn't the first to come up with the idea for a bomb. It was very simultaneous. Physicists all around the world, as we tried to express it in the film. But what I found is when I was reading American Prometheus for the second time, once I decided, okay, I'm in on this, I got to the moment where you realize that Los Alamos was just a place that he and his brother liked to go camping. And then I'm like, okay, that is the most solid connection between somebody's personal interior ambition and life and worldview, and then a thing that lives in infamy, or for me, or both, depending on how you look at it. But it's like this incredibly important place in history, time and place. And it really was down to this one guy. The other way of looking at it is to say, okay, would the atomic bomb have happened without Oppenheimer? Who knows? That's a parallel universe. In the universe we all have to live in, it was him. He put it all together. Groves, he very ambitiously sold himself to Groves. Groves saw what he could do with him, pulled him out, and he facilitated this sort of whole thing happening. And I could relate to the Los Alamos years, his role as director there, because I think there is something about, certainly as a director, you're a kind of jack of all trades, master of none. You know, you don't do anything, right? You don't. I mean, I did write the script, but then I put that to one side, and then you're not acting, you're not recording the sound. Well, you record the sound on your films, but I know most directors don't stand there like that. But so really, it's like, well, what are you doing? Well, you're trying to get the people around you to give of their best, and you're trying to coordinate that into something that works for the script. And the more I studied, and I talked to Cillian about this a lot, the more we looked at how Oppenheimer worked, what he really did, that's what he was great at. He was great at seeing what somebody would be good at and giving them the space, as he did with Teller, with the hydrogen bomb, which was his big, protestation, his big defense in the security hearings. He's like, no, I did help make the hydrogen bomb, because he did give Teller the space. He said, okay, you don't have to worry about, no one wants you doing this stuff anyway. You go off and figure out the hydrogen bomb. So there was a lot to relate to in terms of what the filmmaking process is, versus it's just a big project, limited time, throwing money at things rather than time, if you like. That's very much a tradition in movies. But I think ultimately you start to feel a kinship, even though we come from completely different worlds and have completely different ways of looking at the world. He also is this incredible genius that, we can't think like him. But we can find analogies for how he thought.
Did you have any, because you mentioned an allegiance to the history and the people, did you choose to, you don't have to say it, but did you feel comfortable changing certain things to further the deeper meaning of things?
Yes, I did, but not probably in the way that when people try to assess the accuracy of something, particularly today where you can Google things so fast, or whatever, I didn't change any of that stuff. because that's too difficult. Listen, what Teller says in the security hearings, as we talked about, those are his exact words. I wasn't going to put words in his mouth. But the tone, what he chose to do with the tone, how he chose to play it, that's not there in the transcript. That's interpretive. So in a way, while I was doing the script, I viewed it almost as a documentary process of editing a documentary, where you're looking at the real transcripts, you're looking at the real material, and the material as researched and written about Mackay and Marty. And I'm selecting from it to try and put a mosaic together that follows the rhythms of dramatic structure that's going to involve an audience. But I'm trying to do that without, I'm not changing the substance of each clip, if you like. If you're a documentarian, you're not rewriting the words, you're using the words, but you're chopping them to pieces and sort of making it work the way you're going to. And so I'm a big believer in Werner Herzog's notion of ecstatic truth, that, you know, he actually applied to documentary, you know. It's a little insane.
I love it, though.
But when you go in and you fully embrace it, you say it's basically this idea that you can tell the audience the truth by lying to them. You can tell the audience the truth by manipulating things. And I do believe that, because I think that the way we receive information from a film is different to the way we receive it in a documentary, different to the way we receive it anecdotally or in real life watching something happen.
You're right, because the lie might elicit some kind of emotional response that's more accurate to how it was when it happened.
Exactly. So those are the kind of efficiencies you're trying to do. But I tried to avoid obvious manipulations that weren't true, and I tried to not do anything that somebody could sort of, well, I mean, I happened to go to elementary school with Edward Teller's grandson. So I was speaking to him on the phone, but, you know,
what did he say?
The script, he said he liked the films.
Really?
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah, you know, and he thought you did a great job.
That's great.
Yeah. But yeah, I had conversations with Teller's grandson and with Oppenheimer's grandson, and you know, it's an interesting thing because you want to be able to stand by what you've done, and Charles Oppenheimer, the family was not thrilled with the use of the apple in the book.
Oh, okay.
And so one of my first conversations is, well, you know, they don't believe it happened, or they don't believe it's substantiated. But I looked at the research, and it's very clear that
He did it.
or he said that he did it.
Okay.
And so at a certain point, I mean, a better example, because it's better documented, is the scene with Truman. So Truman offering the handkerchief. There are people who dispute that account. I went with it because that's what Truman said happened. And so to me, even if he didn't actually do it in the moment, if 6 months later he thought that would have been a funny thing to do, he can live with that. He can have that in the film.
Yeah,
you know?
right.
And that's my feeling. So you're making those choices all along because there is no way of documenting absolute objective truth.
Yeah.
We all know that. So I'm trying to do the least clear damage as I could. And the interesting thing is as you start to get the fact-checking, the responses or whatever, there's one thing in the film that I was very worried about that Nilo actually brought to my attention at script stage, which I decided to leave in the film, and nobody has called me on it. And it's the most obvious thing because Ernest Lawrence is there at the White House in the end, and he had died several years before in real life. But it felt very important to have him there in that moment for the way it feels in the film.
Yeah.
And because you're looking at a sort of speculative flash forward, you can make the argument that it's not literal truth or whatever. But the honest answer is, you know, my AD pointed out to me, but none of the historians have called me on it. So I'm like, that's
amazing.
That's okay. Whereas there are other little things.
Nilo,
Well, I have a very well-educated
Yes.
first assistant director, so that helps.
Did all of this come into your brain when you were thinking about changing the name to what it is now?
The thing that came into my brain really is ultimately you're trying to put your stamp on something and make a definitive statement about what the film is about and who the film is about. And I love the title American Prometheus. It's one of the reasons I was drawn to the book. And at a certain point, I was like, we're going to be sitting there in these marketing meetings, and they're going to be showing us the tracking data, and they'll be going, people know there's a movie called American Prometheus out, and they know there's a movie about Oppenheimer, but they don't know it's the same movie. and I've been in those rooms, I've had those conversations, and ultimately, I think with movies, sometimes the most direct route is the way to go, and just say we want to try to make the film a definitive statement about who we think J. Robert Oppenheimer was, and follow his story in that moment, and not try to speak for a more general idea. And, you know, I kept the Promethean metaphor in there pretty strongly because I thought it was very apt, and I really loved what Kai and Marty had done with it. But ultimately, yeah, I just wanted it to be the simplest statement of what the film is about.
Well, and it's also because the other thing is it's not even, yes, it's about the atom bomb, but it's also about him, like, and how he's struggling with what he's doing.
Yeah.
You know, so that, I think, by calling it Oppenheimer, it further directs you inward, you know, in an interesting way.
Yeah, it's about the man rather than the entire situation or the thematic extrapolation of the situation.
Mm-hmm.
It's really just saying, okay, let's come and jump into this guy's head for a couple hours.
The nonlinear nature of the film, it's like you kind of touched on it. They're not really flashbacks, you know, and they're not really flash forwards because, yes, it changes like color and black and white, which is in the script.
Yeah.
That's in the script too, when it changes back and forth. But it does feel like it's part of the same forward momentum.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess the question is like, that's hard to do. So like, how do you kind of keep it? Was there something that you were conscious of in making it not feel like it was going back and forth, but still moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, it's impossible to do if you don't do it at script stage. It has to be in the fabric of the script and the structure of it. And the reason is each strand, as it's braided together, each movement forward has to comment on what you've just seen. So it has to be a step forward, even if chronologically it's a step backwards. It has to further your understanding of something thematically. And if you do that on the page, if that structure's there, then when you come to film it, it'll work. You'll get in the edit suite and the things will fit together if they fit together on the page. If you try and apply it after the fact, it's very unlikely to work. And it's something that, you know, people will sometimes try to do in post to sort of jazz up a movie or try, you know, and it's very tough to do. The first script I ever wrote non-chronologically was the script for my film Following, which I made 16 mil, very, you know, no budget, all that. But what I did with that is I came up with a structure, and it's 3 story strands intertwined. And I thought, well, okay, the best way to write it would be write it chronologically and then chop it up. And so I did that, and it didn't work because what I had to do was so much rewriting to make it flow, because the audience needs to be stepping forward every time. Mm-hmm. Wherever you're going chronologically, you have to be furthering your understanding of whatever the thematic issues that you're most engaged with in that moment. And so you've got to really do it at script stage and embrace it fully.
Unbelievable. Well, I think that's it. That's all the time we have. I wish I could just stand up here and ask more of these, but this was unbelievable, and thank you so much for this movie and this conversation and everything.
Thanks, Benny. Thank you very much.